Hey everyone, tonight we're going on a rather unusual journey, one that takes us back through the annals of human history, not to marvel at grand empires or epic battles, but to peer into the grimmest corners of survival. Imagine, if you will, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a hunger so profound it silences all other thoughts, dulls all other sensations, leaving only a primal ache. You're not just hungry for a snack or even a meal, you're hungry for anything. Your body screams for sustenance, and your mind, usually so discerning, starts to rationalize the truly bizarre. You see something utterly alien to your modern palate, and a tiny, desperate part of you whispers, "Could that be food? You probably won't survive this," but millions before you, faced with unimaginable scarcity, did. They stared into the abyss of starvation and pulled sustenance from the most improbable, often disgusting places. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. And if you're enjoying these nightly ventures into history, hit that like button and follow the channel to ensure you don't miss the next thrilling installment. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world far removed from grocery stores and takeout menus. Picture it. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint, acrid tang of desperation. Your ancestors, these early humans, weren't just hunting woolly mammoths and gathering plump berries. Oh no. When the game migrated, or the usual edible plants withered, their survival instincts kicked into overdrive. You'd be surprised what constitutes a meal when your life depends on it. Take, for instance, lichens. Not the pretty green moss you see on rocks, but the crusty, often bitter stuff that clung to tree bark. You're told it's food. You probably wouldn't believe it, but when your belly echoes, you learn to boil it, pound it, anything to make it digestible. It's chalky, it tastes like tree bark and despair, but it fills a void. Historians still argue whether early humans truly understood the nutritional complexities of these seemingly inedible plants, or if it was pure trial and error. Perhaps a bit of both, with a generous helping of what doesn't kill you makes you temporarily less hungry. Then there's pine needles. Not the festive kind you decorate with, but the source of last resort. You'd learn to boil them, steep them into a kind of bitter tea, or even in extreme cases, chew the soft inner bark of pine trees. It's incredibly fibrous, your jaw aches, and you get splinters, but it offers a semblance of bulk and, surprisingly, some vitamin C. A crucial defense against scurvy, which was probably the least of your worries at the time. Imagine trying to explain to someone from your era that you're eating tree. You might get a few strange looks, perhaps a call to a mental health professional, but your ancient counterpart would simply nod, eyes wide with understanding. It was a common, if unpalatable, fact of life. Even bone marrow. A delicacy today often became a last resort. You might find a discarded carcass picked clean by scavengers, but if you could crack open a femur, that rich, fatty marrow was a lifesaver. It wasn't about savoring the flavor. It was about the dense calories. You'd be meticulously scraping every last smear with a sharp stone, your fingers raw. It's a messy business, but when your body is screaming for fat, you don't fuss. It might seem disgusting now, but in a survival situation, your palate adjusts remarkably quickly. Your taste buds, once so discerning, become remarkably forgiving when faced with the alternative. It's a strange mental shift, isn't it? The difference between disgust and dinner becomes solely a matter of caloric content. You see, the ingenuity of desperation knows no bounds. Mainstream historical fact tells us that early human diets were incredibly varied, reflecting seasonal availability and local ecosystems. But the quirky tidbit is how often they relied on starvation foods that required extensive processing to even become remotely edible, like grinding tough roots or leaching toxins from certain nuts. This wasn't about cooking for pleasure. It was chemistry for survival. And you, as an early human, were a master chemist. Every day was an experiment with hunger as your demanding professor. Your journey through the annals of desperate eating continues, and now you find yourself transported to ancient lands where the very heavens seem to conspire against humanity. Imagine the Fertile Crescent, often idealized as the cradle of civilization. But even here, abundance could turn to dust. You're living in a time when life and death hung precariously on the whims of rain and river, and when the rains failed, the land retaliated with a vengeance. We're talking biblical blights and famines, where the air grew thick with desperation and the desperate measures taken would make your modern stomach churn. You'd be hearing whispers then, increasingly urgent shouts about the crops withering the livestock keeling over. The staple grains, wheat, barley, just wouldn't grow. So what did you eat? Well, mainstream historical fact points to the importance of acorns. In ancient diets, especially in times of scarcity, you'd be out there alongside everyone else collecting these bitter nuts, not just a handful, but sacks full. The process wasn't simple either. You couldn't just pop them in your mouth like a peanut. Oh no, you'd have to leach out the tannins, that astringent mouth-puckering stuff, by soaking them in water for days, sometimes even running water if a stream was nearby. Imagine the effort collecting, soaking, changing the water again and again. It's a monotonous, back-breaking chore, but it meant the difference between life and a slow, agonizing demise. Then you'd pound them into a crude flour, mixing it with whatever else you could find to make a gritty, tasteless gruel. Your modern self might joke, "At least it's gluten-free," but your ancient self would just see calories. Then there's the quirkier side of ancient famine foods. Ever heard of dove's dung? It's mentioned in the Bible during the siege of Samaria. Now, before you gag, historians still argue whether this was literal bird droppings, which, let's be honest, would be truly desperate and largely inedible, or a euphemism for something else. Perhaps a type of vetch, a legume, or even a very low-quality salt that was so cheap and common it became associated with waste. But the sheer imagery of consuming something so foul paints a vivid picture of the sheer depravity of starvation. Imagine the psychological toll being so utterly famished that even the suggestion of such a thing enters the realm of possibility. You'd be looking at every crack in the wall, every patch of dusty ground, wondering what improbable food might lie hidden. You might also find yourself foraging for locusts. Yes, the very insects that swarmed and destroyed crops were ironically a source of protein when all else failed. You wouldn't be picky. You'd be collecting them by the handful, roasting them over a meager fire. They'd be crunchy, a bit earthy, maybe even a little nutty, if you were really trying to put a positive spin on it. It's certainly not your ideal meal, but when your body is screaming for protein, a roasted locust suddenly looks a lot more appetizing than an empty stomach. You'd chew them slowly, feeling the brittle exoskeletons crunch between your teeth, trying to extract every last bit of energy. It's a stark reminder that what one culture views as a pest, another views as a life raft. The air around you would be thick with the smell of wood smoke and the faint, unsettling scent of desperation. People would move slower, their eyes hollow their movements, deliberate, conserving every ounce of energy. You'd notice the thinness of arms, the sharp angles of collarbones. Every sound, every shadow would be filtered through the lens of hunger. The world shrinks to the immediate need for sustenance. You might even find yourself contemplating things you swore you never would simply because your body has overridden your mind's usual moral compass. The human body, when pushed to its limits, reveals a terrifying adaptability. Your historical gastronomic tour now whisks you away to the heart of a sprawling empire, a place often lauded for its engineering marvels and vast conquests. Yet even the mighty Roman Empire was not immune to the specter of famine. You find yourself in ancient Rome, a city fed by its vast provinces, but when supply lines faltered or harvests failed, the consequences were dire, and the Spain. Roman populace resorted to strange substitutes to stave off starvation. Imagine the bustling markets, usually overflowing with grains and exotic fruits, slowly emptying the air, buzzing not with commerce, but with a low hum of anxiety. Mainstream historical fact confirms that pulses like lentils and chickpeas were always a staple in the Roman diet, particularly for the common folk. But during a famine, even these humble legumes became scarce, and people turned to truly desperate measures. You'd witness individuals sifting through the streets not for dropped coins, but for fallen seeds, discarded scraps, anything that might be remotely digestible. The idea of waste not, want not became less a proverb and more a desperate cry for survival. You might find yourself chewing on dried bits of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans slathered on everything. While normally a condiment in times of extreme hunger, it would be consumed almost straight for whatever meager calories and salt it could provide. It probably tasted like liquid despair with a hint of fish. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. During severe food shortages, even the plebs, the common Roman citizens, were known to grind down a pochma, grape seeds and olive pits, into a coarse flour. Think about that for a second. The stony, bitter remnants of winemaking and olive oil production, usually discarded, were suddenly seen as a potential source of sustenance. You'd be laboring over a grindstone, crushing these unbelievably hard materials, your hands aching, your teeth probably aching just thinking about it. The resulting flour would be incredibly low in nutrients, gritty, and likely tasted terrible, but it added bulk to whatever meager gruel could be concocted. Historians still argue whether this was a truly effective famine food or merely a psychological comfort, a way to feel like you were eating something substantial, even if it provided little energy. Probably a bit of both, a grim form of culinary placebo. You'd also see people foraging for wild roots and leaves. In the Roman Campagna, the countryside surrounding the city, not just familiar herbs, but anything that looked vaguely edible. Dandelions, thistles, nettles. You'd learn quickly which ones needed boiling to remove bitterness or stinging properties. Your hands would be stained green, your clothes dusty, and your stomach still growling. It was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Rome, a city that projected an image of power and plenty, yet its citizens could be reduced to grubbing for weeds like any peasant. The illusion of imperial might dissolved quickly when faced with the primal urge to survive. Imagine the sounds, the constant rumbling of your own stomach, echoed by the faint collective grumbles of a city in distress. The usual laughter and chatter of the forum would be muted, replaced by an unsettling quiet, punctuated by the occasional coughs of the weakened. You'd move slower, conserving every ounce of precious energy, your senses hyper-alert to any potential source of calories. A stray cat. A bird. Suddenly, your perception of food broadens considerably. It's a humbling experience to realize how thin the veneer of civilization can be when faced with the most basic human need. Leaving the grandeur and hidden desperation of Rome behind you, now find yourself cloaked in the somber robes of the medieval era. The world has shifted, centered now around manors, villages, and crucially, monasteries, which often served as centers of learning and charity, but also, surprisingly, as grim bellwethers of famine. You're entering a time when faith was a pillar, but hunger could shake even the most devout. When harvests failed or plagues decimated populations, the usually rigid dietary rules of monastic life often bent under the immense pressure of survival. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes that medieval European diets, particularly for the common folk, were heavily reliant on cereals like rye oats and barley. Meat was a luxury, and during Lent or other fasts, even eggs and dairy were forbidden. But imagine a famine descending, the fields lie barren, the granaries are empty, and even the monasteries with their often vast landholdings find themselves in dire straits. Their charitable mission suddenly collides with the brutal reality of too many hungry mouths and not enough food. You'd see the monks, usually stoic and disciplined, growing gaunt, their prayers perhaps less about spiritual enlightenment and more about the simple miracle of food. So what did they eat? Here's where it gets quirky. While normally abstaining from most meats during severe famines, some monastic communities would resort to consuming sei, waterfowl, and fish of all kinds, but in a way that stretched the definition of fish. Think of beaver tails and even puffin, which were sometimes classified as fish by clever theological loopholes, allowing their consumption during times of fasting and scarcity. Imagine a monk, usually subsisting on bread and gruel, eyeing a beaver swimming by, thinking not of its fur, but of its scaly tail, deemed fish-like enough to pass muster. It's a hilarious, if desperate, example of how even strict religious doctrine could be bent by the exigencies of an empty stomach. Historians still argue whether these classifications were genuinely about theological interpretation or simply pragmatic survival cloaked in piety. Your own stomach would probably not care about the theological debate. You might also witness monks and lay brothers scouring the monastery grounds and surrounding woods for foraged greens and roots that were typically ignored. We're talking about things like nettles, wild garlic, and the inner bark of elm or birch trees. These weren't culinary delights. They were simply bulk something to fill the gnawing void. You'd see them meticulously stripping bark, then boiling and pounding it into a pulp, trying to make it digestible. It would taste woody bitter and likely cause digestive distress, but it was better than nothing. The silence of the cloisters would be punctuated by the rhythmic thud of mortars and pestles, crushing not just medicinal herbs, but desperate meals. The air in the monastery, usually redolent with incense and old parchment, would now carry the faint earthy scent of boiled roots and the pervasive metallic tang of hunger. You'd observe the slow, deliberate movements of the inhabitants, each action weighed against the energy it expended. Prayers would feel heavier hymns sung with less vigor. Even within the walls of spiritual sanctuary, the primal need for sustenance asserted its dominance, reminding everyone that even the soul is tied to the survival of the body. Your journey through desperate diets now sails you to the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of the north. Picture towering fjords, icy winds whipping across desolate shores, and long, dark winters that stretched on seemingly endlessly. You're among the Vikings Dubas, names renowned for their seafaring prowess and fearsome raids, but even these formidable warriors faced periods of profound scarcity, particularly when their agricultural efforts yielded little or their expeditions proved fruitless. This wasn't just about surviving a bad harvest. It was about enduring a brutal climate that could turn even a good year into a struggle. Mainstream historical fact tells us that Viking diets were perhaps surprisingly quite varied, including a lot of fish, marine mammals, and livestock. However, the long winters and unpredictable climate meant that stored provisions were critical, and when those ran low, desperation set in. You'd witness families meticulously rationing their dried fish and cured meats, each portion a grim reminder of their dwindling supplies. The air would be thin and cold, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and the sharp tang of the sea. But here's where the quirky tidbit comes in when traditional food sources became critically scarce. The Vikings, with their incredible resourcefulness, turned to what you might call winter weeds. They would often resort to collecting and processing lichens, particularly what's known as Icelandic moss, Catraria islandica. Now remember those bitter lichens from Section 1. This is a relative and it's equally unappealing. You'd be out on the frozen ground, scraping this stuff off rocks and trees, your fingers numb with cold. It looks like dried, shriveled leaves, brittle and unappetizing. To make it edible, you'd have to boil it often with ash or soda to neutralize the bitter acids, then pound it into a gelatinous, unappetizing gruel. It's bland, slimy, and utterly devoid of anything resembling flavor, but it offered precious calories and some fiber. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of such marginal foods indicates regular periods of near famine or simply extreme foresight in preparing for the worst. You, however, would simply be grateful for the slight warmth it offered in your belly. You'd also see them utilizing parts of plants that we, in our modern world, would simply discard. Think tarnprajsk tree bark. Specifically, the inner cambium layer of pine or birch. This thin, sweetish layer just beneath the rough outer bark could be scraped off dried ground into a powder and mixed with whatever meager flour was left to extend it. It adds a woody, slightly resinous flavor to your bread, but it provides some carbohydrates. Imagine gnawing on a piece of tree not as a desperate last resort, but as a recognized method of supplementing your diet during a long, harsh winter. Your teeth might ache and your jaw might protest, but your stomach would quiet, if only for a little while. The sounds of the Viking settlement would be muted in winter, the crunch of snow underfoot, the howl of the wind, and the occasional creak of a long ship straining at its moorings. Laughter would be rare, replaced by the quiet determination of a people constantly battling the elements. Every meager meal would be consumed with a quiet reverence, a tacit acknowledgement of the struggle to obtain it. You'd learn to appreciate the simplest warmth, the smallest morsel, and the resilience of a human body pushed to its absolute limits, finding sustenance in the most improbable places. From the windswept fjords of the north, your historical culinary journey now brings you to a verdant isle, tragically famous for a profound ecological and social catastrophe, Ireland in the mid-19th century. Here you'll witness the devastating impact of the Irish potato famine. A period when a single crop's failure plunged millions into unimaginable destitution and forced them to consume things that would make your hair stand on end. You are standing in the muddy fields, the air thick with the smell of decay, not just of the blighted potato crops, but of hope itself. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes the overwhelming reliance of the Irish population on the potato. It was a caloric powerhouse, easy to grow in small plots, and incredibly nutritious. But when Pisovwar Phytophthora infestans, Cedos potato blight, struck year after year, turning the staple food into a black putrid mush, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. You'd see entire families staring at their fields, once green with promise, now blackened with despair. The silence would be heavy, broken only by the whimpering of hungry children. What did they eat then? The desperation drove people to astonishing lengths. A particularly grim and quirky tidbit reveals that people resorted to eating famine food, which included seaweed. Not just any seaweed, but specific varieties like dulse and carrageen moss. You'd be out on the rocky coastlines, even in the depths of winter, collecting slimy, salty fronds, your hands raw and frozen. It's certainly not a calorie-dense food providing more bulk and some minerals than actual energy, but it was something. Imagine boiling it down, trying to make a thick, gelatinous soup that tasted overwhelmingly of the sea and felt vaguely like snot. Historians still argue about the true nutritional contribution of seaweed during the famine. Some suggest it merely staved off scurvy, while others believe it provided just enough bulk to prolong suffering without offering true sustenance. You, however, would simply swallow grateful for anything to fill the void. Beyond seaweed, the truly horrifying alternatives emerged. You'd hear whispered stories, sometimes confirmed by grim reality, of people consuming grass and weeds. Not carefully selected edible greens, but whatever could be scrounged from the dirt. You might see someone desperate, literally chewing on handfuls of field grass, trying to extract any last bit of moisture or fiber, their mouths stained green. This was often mixed with nettles. Carefully boiled, to remove the sting of dandelions and other wild plants. It offered almost no nutritional value and often led to further illness, but the sheer act of putting something in your mouth, of tricking your body into believing it was being fed, was a psychological anchor in a sea of despair. The pervasive smell of hunger would hang heavy in the air, a mix of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the faint, unsettling scent of death. You'd see the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes, the desperate pleas. The silence would be punctuated by the coughs of the sick and the cries of the starving. It's a profound and devastating lesson in how utterly vulnerable even a seemingly robust society can be when its primary food source vanishes. Your own stomach would ache in empathy, witnessing the unimaginable suffering that stemmed from a microscopic fungus. From the tragic landscapes of famine-stricken Ireland, your journey now crosses the vast Atlantic, landing you on the rugged, untamed shores of North America. You're no longer observing ancient empires or medieval monasteries, but rather the hardscrabble beginnings of a new nation. This is the era of colonial American customs, where early settlers, far from the familiar bounty of their homelands, faced daunting challenges in feeding themselves. They found themselves in an alien environment, forced to adapt to new, often unappetizing local resources or perish. Imagine the dense forests looming, the unfamiliar sounds of new wildlife, and the chilling realization that your survival depended entirely on what this wild land could provide. Mainstream historical fact confirms that early colonial life was brutal, with many initial settlements failing due to starvation and disease. The first winters were particularly harsh, as European crops often struggled in the new soil and climate. You'd witness settlers arriving with grand hopes, only to be confronted by a stark reality. What they knew as food back home simply didn't exist here in the same quantity or form. The diet quickly shifted to whatever could be hunted, fished, or gathered from the indigenous plants. But here's a quirky tidbit: faced with unfamiliar flora and dwindling supplies, the colonists learned, often from Native American populations, to utilize surprising local resources. One of these was sassafras. Now you might know sassafras for its pleasant root beer, like aroma often used in teas or traditional remedies. But during periods of severe hunger, the colonists would consume almost every part of the tree, the leaves used as a thickening agent in soups, like in gumbo, the twigs chewed for their mild flavor, and even the inner bark. While not a caloric powerhouse, it was a source of some nutrients, and crucially, it filled the stomach with something. Imagine trying to make a meal out of tree bark and leaves, your European palate likely protesting vehemently, but your body gratefully accepting any bulk. Historians still argue about the true nutritional contribution of such wild plants to the colonial diet, some seeing them as lifesavers, others as mere palliatives for chronic hunger. You'd also see the desperate turn to picos, acorns. Once again, much like the ancient peoples, the forests were abundant with oak trees, and the native peoples had long known how to process these bitter nuts. The colonists, if they survived long enough to learn, would follow suit, leaching the tannins out of vast quantities of acorns to make a coarse, somewhat palatable flour. It was a laborious process reminiscent of the biblical blights, a full-circle moment in the history of famine foods. You'd spend days soaking and drying your hands, chapped your clothes perpetually dusty with the fine irritating powder. The air would carry the scent of wood-smoked damp earth and the persistent low hum of mosquitoes. The sounds of axe strokes clearing land would be interspersed with the distant cries of unknown animals. You'd feel the constant gnawing of hunger, a dull ache that permeated every activity. Life was a relentless struggle for sustenance, a constant negotiation with the wilderness. Every berry found, every root unearthed, every small creature snared, was a victory, a brief reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. It was a raw, unfiltered lesson in survival where ingenuity and desperation forged a new way of eating. Leaving the struggling colonial settlements behind you, now step into a world of vast, untamed spaces and relentless westward expansion, the American frontier. This is the 19th century, a time of covered wagons, dusty trails, and the indomitable spirit of pioneers venturing into the unknown. But this romanticized image often overlooks a brutal truth. Survival on the frontier was precarious, and when supplies dwindled, the trailblazers resorted to some truly odd things to eat. You find yourself jostling in a wagon, the endless plains stretching before you, the constant creak of wheels your only companion, and a growing emptiness in your stomach. Mainstream historical fact confirms that pioneers relied heavily on cured meats, dried beans, and cornmeal for their arduous journeys. But the trails were long unpredictable and often dangerous. Accidents happened, provisions spoiled, and game could be scarce. You'd quickly learn that the romantic notion of hunting buffalo on demand was often a fantasy. More frequently, it was a desperate search for any caloric input. You'd feel the tension in the wagon as food bags grew lighter, the conversation's quieting eyes constantly scanning the horizon for anything edible. Here's a particularly quirky tidbit. When meat became critically scarce, some pioneers resorted to consuming prairie oysters, which, despite the suggestive name, were not shellfish at all. This was a euphemism for animal testicles, typically from cattle or buffalo, particularly when slaughtering animals for other purposes. While not a primary food source, these organs were rich in protein and fat, and when faced with starvation, no part of a slaughtered animal was wasted. Imagine the grim task of preparing such a meal over a meager campfire, trying to suppress the instinctive revulsion as you chew on something so fundamentally unconventional. Historians still argue how common this practice truly was, given the often delicate sensibilities of the era, but the sheer mention of it highlights the extreme lengths people would go. You'd also hear tales and perhaps witness the reality of pioneers resorting to eating animal hides. Not the fur, of course, but softening and boiling leather straps from harnesses or shoes, trying to extract any last bit of protein or gelatin. Imagine gnawing on a boiled boot, the smell of cooked leather filling your nostrils. It's tough, rubbery, and utterly devoid of flavor, but it offered the illusion of sustenance. Your teeth would ache, your jaw would protest, but the desperate hunger would override all objections. It's a stark reminder that in survival, texture and taste becomes secondary to caloric intake. The sounds of the frontier would be a mix of the vast emptiness of the plains, the persistent whine of the wind, and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. You'd move with a slow, deliberate gait, conserving energy, your mind constantly calculating dwindling supplies and potential new food sources. Every distant cloud of dust, every rustle in the tall grass would be scrutinized not with curiosity, but with the desperate hope of finding sustenance. The relentless sun would bake the land, and the nights would be cold each passing day, a test of endurance. It was a life where the line between civilization and savagery blurred, and the definition of food stretched to its absolute breaking point. Your relentless journey through humanity's most desperate diets now transports you to a vast frigid land of stark beauty and brutal winter Siberia. You're entering the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period marked by vast distances, harsh climates, and recurrent famines that swept through the Russian Empire, often hitting its distant and isolated regions the hardest. Here in the heart of Eurasia, you'll encounter the truly extreme and often bizarre foods consumed during Russian famines, where survival pushed ingenuity to its very limits. Imagine the biting cold, the endless snow, and the quiet despair of a landscape that offers little comfort. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes that Russian peasants, the vast majority of the population, lived precariously close to the subsistence level. Their diet was heavily reliant on rye bread potatoes and kasha porridge. But when harvests failed or political turmoil disrupted food distribution, the consequences were devastating. You'd see entire villages grow gaunt, their homes devoid of the comforting smell of baking bread, replaced by the chilling silence of empty bellies. The wind would howl, carrying not just snow, but the quiet desperation of a starving populace. Here's a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this grim era. In the deepest pockets of starvation, people resorted to consuming kleb is salami, itan or mar, straw bread. This wasn't just a bit of straw mixed into flour. It was often predominantly straw. You'd witness peasants gathering whatever straw was left after the harvest, chopping it finely, then mixing it with a tiny amount of flour, sometimes less than 10%, along with wild plants, ground bark, or even clay to bind it. The resulting bread was incredibly rough, indigestible, and provided almost no nutritional value. It was essentially eating flavored cardboard, a desperate attempt to fill the stomach and quiet the agonizing pangs of hunger, even if it led to severe intestinal blockages and further illness. Historians still argue whether such bread prolonged life or merely prolonged suffering. Your own stomach would clench at the thought, but your historical self would simply swallow. Beyond straw, the sheer lack of food led to the consumption of truly bizarre things. You might see individuals boiling and eating cattails, the bulrushes that grow by water, not the animal's tail, thankfully specifically the starchy rootstocks. These could be ground into a flour-like substance, offering some carbohydrate, or more disturbingly, the widespread consumption of podberezovic, a Russian term that could refer to a type of edible mushroom, but in famine contexts often broadened to mean any fungus found regardless of its edibility. This led to widespread poisoning as desperate people consumed toxic varieties, mistaking them for nourishing food. Imagine the agonizing choice, slow starvation, or the risk of immediate violent illness. The sounds of Siberia during a famine would be hauntingly quiet, the crunch of snow underfoot, the relentless whistling of the wind, and the muted cries of children. You'd observe the emaciated bodies, the desperate eyes, and the quiet resignation that often accompanied prolonged starvation. Survival was a daily, often losing battle against an unforgiving land and an indifferent fate. The sheer willpower to keep going, to find anything to eat in such a desolate landscape, is a testament to the raw tenacity of the human spirit. From the bleak vastness of Siberia, your journey through humanity's most desperate meals now plunges into the global crucible of the 20th century, the World Wars. Here you'll witness how entire nations, not just isolated communities, were forced to adapt their diets to the brutal realities of total war scarcity and blockades. You're standing in a ration queue, the air thin with tension, your ration book clutched tight in your hand, and the distinct smell of ersatz coffee wafting from a nearby cafe. Mainstream historical fact confirms that both World War I and World War II necessitated unprecedented levels of food rationing and austerity in many combatant nations. Supply lines were disrupted, agricultural labor was diverted to the front, and enemy blockades aimed to starve populations into submission. You'd feel the constant low-level hum of anxiety, the endless discussions about what could be found, what could be substituted. The very notion of a full meal became a distant, almost luxurious memory. Here's a particularly quirky tidbit that emerged from the wartime scarcity, the widespread popularity of mock foods. And ersatz. Ingredients. Imagine trying to make a cake without eggs, butter, or sugar. You'd be sifting through recipes for wartime cakes or economy puddings that called for things like grated carrots for sweetness and moisture, mashed potatoes for bulk, and even vinegar or baking soda as leavening agents instead of scarce eggs. Or consider mock goose made from lentils and breadcrumbs, or mock fish fashioned from leftover vegetables. It was a testament to culinary ingenuity under duress, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of normalcy and comfort through familiar meal names, even if the ingredients were anything but. Historians still argue whether these mock foods provided significant nutritional value or were primarily a psychological boost for morale. Your taste buds, however, would likely lean towards the latter. You'd also find yourself cultivating a soothe victory garden. Not a small patch for a few tomatoes, but an earnest effort to grow whatever you possibly could in every available space: backyards, parks, even rooftops. This was more than a hobby. It was a patriotic duty and a vital source of fresh produce when commercial supplies were scarce or non-existent. You'd be meticulously tending to rows of cabbage, potatoes, and beans, your hands calloused your back, aching but with a quiet sense of purpose. Every ripe vegetable was a small victory against the overarching scarcity. The sounds of wartime daily life would be a mix of distant air raid sirens, the crackle of radio broadcasts delivering grim news, and the constant murmur of conversations about rations and shortages. You'd observe people moving with a quiet determination, their faces etched with the strain of living under constant pressure. The smell of frying onions, a rare treat, or boiled cabbage would suddenly become immensely appealing. Even the simplest ingredients were valued every crumb saved. The world wars transformed not just geopolitics, but the very way entire societies thought about and consumed food, etching lessons of frugality and resourcefulness into the collective memory that lingered for generations. Stepping away from the global conflict, you now find yourself in the unique economic maelstrom that gripped the United States in the 1930s, the Great Depression. This wasn't a famine caused by war or blight, but by systemic economic collapse, plunging millions into poverty and unemployment. Here you'll witness the ingenious and often grim ways Americans stretched their food, turning the seemingly inedible into sustenance. You're standing in a breadline, the air thick with the unspoken anxieties of men and women who just months or years prior had known stability. The scent of stale air and desperation hangs heavy. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes that unemployment soared and soup kitchens became a lifeline for many. Families who had once enjoyed varied diets suddenly found themselves with almost no income, forcing radical changes to their eating habits. You'd feel the constant dull ache of chronic hunger, not the acute pain of starvation, but a persistent hollowness that wore down the spirit. Every penny spent on food was a critical decision, every scrap of food a treasure. Here's a particularly quirky tidbit that emerged from this period of widespread scarcity: the notorious Hoover stew, or Depression stew. This wasn't a recipe with precise measurements. It was a desperate concoction, a symbol of making something out of nothing. You'd throw whatever meager ingredients you could scrounge into a pot, perhaps some donated stale bread, a few withered vegetables, like carrots or onions, a bone for flavor, and if you were incredibly lucky, a bit of fat or leftover meat. The key was to make it stretch to create enough bulk to fill empty bellies, even if the nutritional value was questionable. Imagine the taste bland, watery, and vaguely reminiscent of everything and nothing. Historians still debate whether such recipes truly alleviated hunger or merely prolonged a state of malnourishment, but for many, it was the only thing standing between them and utter starvation. You, however, would just be grateful for the warmth and the temporary illusion of fullness. Beyond the stew, people became masters of stretching ingredients. You'd see families repurposing everything. Dandelions, once considered a nuisance weed, became a prized green boiled and served with vinegar. Wild greens like lamb's quarters and poke salad were gathered from fields and roadsides. People would make water gravy by thickening seasoned water with a bit of flour, serving it over stale bread or boiled potatoes to make a meal. The creativity born of necessity was astonishing yet heartbreaking. You'd learn to savor every bite, to find pleasure in the smallest portion, and to never ever waste a crumb. The sounds of the Great Depression would be a haunting mix of silence and soft murmurs, the shuffling of feet in bread lines, the hushed conversations about dwindling prospects, and the rhythmic clatter of pots in soup kitchens. You'd observe the stoicism on people's faces, the weariness in their eyes, and the quiet dignity with which they faced immense hardship. The air would carry the faint smell of wood smoke from makeshift fires and the ever-present low hum of collective worry. It was a time when the very definition of food was stripped down to its most basic, and survival depended on an almost alchemical ability to transform scarcity into sustenance. From the economic struggles of the Great Depression, your chilling journey now takes an even darker turn, depositing you into one of the most harrowing sieges in modern history, the Siege of Leningrad. During World War II, here from 1941 to 1944, a major Soviet city was encircled by Nazi forces, cutting off all supplies for nearly 900 days. You will bear witness to unimaginable culinary choices where the line between food and inedible vanished completely, driven by starvation of an almost incomprehensible scale. You're in a city plunged into perpetual twilight by winter and war, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the pervasive metallic tang of cold and hunger. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes the meticulous rationing system implemented in Leningrad, but as the siege wore on, these rations dwindled to mere crumbs. By the winter of 1941-42, daily bread rations for civilians fell to a mere 125 grams, about 2 thin slices, primarily composed of cellulose and sawdust. You'd feel the relentless, bone-deep cold exacerbated by the lack of food. Every movement would be an immense effort, every thought consumed by the desperate need for calories. Your body would slowly begin to shut down, prioritizing vital organs, sacrificing muscle and fat. Here's a truly grim and quirky tidbit from the siege: the desperate consumption of membrane technical fats and protein substitutes. Imagine scientists and desperate civilians trying to extract any caloric value from whatever was available. This included industrial lubricants like castor oil wallpaper paste, and even the glycerin extracted from discarded leather belts and boots. You'd see people trying to boil down leather, hoping to get some gelatinous substance to provide any form of energy. The taste would be indescribable, chemical, acrid, utterly vile, but when your body is screaming for sustenance, your senses become dulled by the overriding demand for survival. Historians still argue about the precise chemical composition of some of these foods and how much actual nutritional value they could provide, but their mere consumption highlights the horrific extent of the famine. Beyond these industrial foods, the residents of Leningrad resorted to consuming virtually anything organic. You'd hear whispered, then openly discussed accounts of eating pets. Cats and dogs vanished not as collateral damage of bombing, but as grim protein sources. Then came the sting bird spike and ice, followed by rats, mice. The city zoo was emptied, its animals consumed. You'd see people boiling parchment pine needles, not just for vitamin C, but for any available fiber. Sawdust, mixed into the minuscule bread rations, was a common, if highly indigestible, additive. Imagine the desperate crunch of wood particles between your teeth, the feeling of your stomach struggling to process something entirely foreign to its design. The sounds of besieged Leningrad would be a terrifying symphony of silence and distant explosions, the relentless boom of artillery, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the almost unbearable quiet of a city slowly dying. You'd observe the emaciated figures shuffling through the frozen streets, their eyes hollow, their faces reflecting a profound and quiet despair. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of ash decay and the ever-present biting cold that chilled you to the bone. This was not just a historical event, it was a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance, where the most basic definition of food was reduced to survival itself. Leaving the frozen, starving streets of Leningrad, your journey now transports you to a different, equally harrowing 20th century tragedy, the Great Chinese Famine. This catastrophic event, primarily between 1959 and 1961, was a man-made disaster, largely a consequence of Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward policies. Here you'll witness the bizarre and tragically extensive lengths to which millions of people were driven in their desperate search for sustenance. You find yourself in a parched landscape, the communal fields barren, and the silence of desperation broken only by the whimpering of hungry children. Mainstream historical fact confirms that Mao's ambitious agricultural reforms combined with poor weather led to an unprecedented collapse in food production. Grain was often misreported, seized, or wasted, leaving vast rural populations with nothing. You'd feel the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a pervasive ache that dulled all other senses. The air would be heavy with dust and the scent of decay, and the sun, instead of bringing warmth, would simply beat down on a landscape devoid of life. Here's a particularly bizarre and heartbreaking tidbit from this period: the widespread consumption of just guanyin soil, or Mondi, Ibe, Ikar's white clay. Imagine people utterly desperate digging up a specific type of white, yellowish, or black earth that was prevalent in certain regions. This clay contained minerals, but absolutely no nutritional value. It was boiled into a gruel, or mixed with what little wild plants could be found, or even eaten directly to fill the stomach and create a temporary feeling of fullness. The horrifying reality was that while it might alleviate hunger pangs for a short while, it caused severe intestinal blockages, swelling, and ultimately a slow and agonizing death. Historians still argue about the precise geographical extent of this practice, but the fact that it was recorded at all is a grim testament to the absolute limits of human desperation. You watching this would feel your own stomach rebel at the thought, but for the starving, it was the only option left. Beyond clay, the desperate turned to consuming virtually anything organic. You'd see people stripping one tree bark. Not just the inner cambium layer, but the rough outer bark, too, boiling it for hours in the desperate hope of softening it enough to chew. Wild weeds. Even those known to be unpalatable or mildly toxic were consumed in vast quantities. People ate grass, literally pulling it from the ground and chewing it, trying to extract any last bit of moisture or fiber. Even the droppings of animals were reportedly sifted through for undigested seeds. You'd witness families meticulously boiling down whatever wild roots they could find, turning them into a thin, bitter gruel. The sheer level of foraging was astounding, wiping out local ecosystems of anything edible. The sounds of the Great Chinese Famine would be a haunting quiet, the rustle of dry leaves, the soft, exhausted sighs of a populace too weak to cry out, and the pervasive absence of the usual sounds of rural life. You'd observe the skeletal figures, their faces sunken, their eyes wide with hunger and a profound, quiet despair. The air would carry the dust of barren fields and the faint, unsettling smell of death. This was a tragedy on an unimaginable scale, a grim reminder of how political policies combined with natural challenges can push an entire society to the absolute brink, forcing them to eat the earth itself to survive. From the man-made horrors of the Great Chinese Famine, your harrowing journey through desperate diets now plunges into the brutal and genocidal regime of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Primarily during the years 1975 to 1979, here, under Pol Pot's fanatical rule, an entire nation was forcibly depopulated from its cities and subjected to forced labor, starvation, and execution in the killing fields. You will witness the horrifying lengths people went to for sustenance, where the very act of finding food became a life-or-death struggle against an oppressive system and an emptied land. You're in a vast rural work camp, the air thick with humidity, the stench of unburied dead, and the constant gnawing fear. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the Khmer Rouge's radical agrarian policies, coupled with their systematic dismantling of existing infrastructure and the deliberate persecution of any perceived enemies, led to widespread famine. Food was strictly rationed if given at all and often confiscated. You'd feel the relentless exhaustion from forced labor under the scorching sun compounded by profound hunger. Your body would ache, your mind would be dulled by the constant struggle, and every thought would revolve around the next elusive morsel. Here's a particularly grim and disturbing tidbit. From this period, the forced consumption of bout, insects, spiders, and even small reptiles, often as the only available protein source. You'd be out in the fields working under the watchful eyes of armed guards, secretly snatching up tarantulas, crickets, grasshoppers, and small geckos. These would be quickly roasted over a tiny clandestine fire or even eaten raw if the hunger was too overwhelming. The fear of being caught for unauthorized foraging often meant execution was almost as strong as the hunger itself. Imagine the texture crunchy, earthy, and if you were lucky, a little fatty. Historians still debate the full extent to which such survival foods sustained the population versus merely prolonging an agonizing death, but their sheer prevalence underscores the unspeakable conditions. Beyond insects, the starving populace resorted to whatever the ravaged landscape could offer. You'd see people sifting through human waste for undigested grains, a truly repulsive act of ultimate desperation. The roots of yam, water lilies, and other aquatic plants normally ignored became prized sources of meager calories dug up from muddy ponds. You'd be meticulously searching for wild tubers and roots, some of which were toxic and required careful preparation, often by boiling them multiple times. The risk of poisoning was high, but it was a calculated gamble against immediate starvation. Every plant, every creature was scrutinized for its potential as a food source, no matter how small or unappealing. The sounds of Khmer Rouge Cambodia would be a chilling mix of forced labor, the quiet shuffling of exhausted bodies, and the distant chilling crack of rifle fire. You'd observe the emaciated figures, their eyes hollow with fear and hunger, their movements slow and deliberate. The air would be heavy with humidity, the smell of decaying vegetation, and the pervasive metallic scent of fear. This was not merely a famine, it was a deliberate starvation, engineered by a brutal regime pushing human beings beyond the limits of imagination in their desperate daily struggle to find anything to put in their mouths. Your grim journey through famine's history now takes you to one of the most isolated and secretive nations on Earth, North Korea. Specifically, you are witnessing the devastating impact of the arduous march, the famine that gripped the country in the mid-1990s. This was a period of profound food scarcity, largely triggered by economic collapse, natural disasters, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had propped up the North Korean economy. Here, you'll examine the desperate foraging and consumption of unusual plants, a testament to a population pushed to its absolute limits under a totalitarian regime. You're in a stark rural landscape, the air often cold and still, the pervasive silence broken only by the gnawing of your own stomach. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the famine resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of North Koreans. The public distribution system, which had previously provided food, collapsed, leaving most citizens to fend for themselves. You'd feel the profound exhaustion from constant hunger, the dull ache in your bones, and the ever-present threat of informers. Survival wasn't just about finding food. It was about doing so without attracting unwanted attention from the authorities. Here's a particularly poignant and quirky tidbit from this period: the widespread reliance on walsbolvotin and people bart fumum, or bontenora, nature's gifts. A euphemism for whatever could be scrounged from the environment. This often included bon nettles, and which you'd learn to meticulously boil multiple times to remove their stinging hairs, transforming them into a bitter yet edible green. You'd also see people foraging for acorns, and much like the desperate populations of ancient Rome or the American frontier. They'd be collected by the basketful, then carefully processed through repeated washing and boiling to leach out the bitter tannins before being ground into a coarse flour. Imagine the repetitive, backbreaking work knowing that your life depended on every single painstakingly processed acorn. Historians still argue about the long-term health consequences of such a high-fiber, low-nutrient diet, but for those living it, it was simply the difference between another day and death. Beyond nettles and acorns, the desperate population turned to whatever grew, no matter how unappetizing or dangerous. You'd hear whispered stories of people boiling down hop pine needles, not just for a semblance of bulk, but also for whatever trace nutrients they might offer. Tree bark, particularly the inner cambium layer of certain trees like elm, was stripped dried and ground into a powder to extend meager rations of corn flour. You'd witness individuals discreetly digging for wild roots, even those known to be mildly toxic, hoping that careful preparation would render them edible. The risk of food poisoning was a constant companion, but it was a risk deemed necessary when starvation was the only alternative. The sounds of North Korea during the famine would be hauntingly quiet, the soft shuffling of emaciated bodies, the distant rustle of leaves in the wind, and the pervasive absence of normal human chatter. You'd observe the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes, and the quiet determination to simply survive another day. The air would carry the cold scent of the mountains and the faint, unsettling smell of decaying vegetation. This was a chilling testament to how a combination of systemic failure and isolation can push an entire population to revert to the most primitive forms of sustenance, forcing them to literally eat the landscape to survive. Your journey now sweeps you across continents, bringing you to the vast and diverse landscapes of Africa. Here you'll encounter a sobering reality. Despite its rich biodiversity, many regions in Africa have historically and continue to face recurrent famines, often exacerbated by conflict, climate change, and political instability. You'll explore the traditional and often bizarre famine foods that various African cultures have adapted to survive these periods of profound scarcity. You're standing in a parched village, the sun beating down mercilessly, the air thick with dust, and the silence broken only by the distant cries of a hungry child. Mainstream historical fact confirms that many African communities develop deep knowledge of their local ecosystems, identifying a vast array of wild plants and animals that could sustain them during dry seasons or times of famine. However, when prolonged droughts hit or conflicts displaced populations, even this indigenous knowledge was stretched to its absolute limits. You'd feel the relentless thirst, the dizzying weakness from lack of food, and the heavy weight of communal anxiety. Here's a particularly fascinating and often quirky adaptation from certain arid regions: the reliance on desert succulents and specific types of gourds that are typically considered unpalatable or even mildly toxic in normal times. For instance, in parts of the Sahel, communities have historically turned to the tsama melon, Citrullus lanitus, a wild cousin of the watermelon when water and food are scarce. While often bitter and not very sweet, it provides essential moisture and some calories. Imagine cutting open a tough green melon in the scorching heat, its watery flesh offering a fleeting moment of relief. Historians still argue about the precise methods different tribes used to detoxify certain wild gourds or roots. Some involved extensive boiling, others burying in sand. It's a testament to incredible indigenous knowledge. Beyond these succulents, you'd witness the desperate consumption of barked wild grasses and seeds that would typically be overlooked. Not just familiar grains, but seeds from wild sorghum or millet varieties painstakingly collected from the dried stalks, then ground into a rough, low-nutrient flour. You might also observe communities consuming specific types of chantanai insects that emerge after brief rains, such as locusts or termites. Often roasted for a protein boost. While considered a delicacy in some cultures during a famine, they are consumed out of sheer necessity without ceremony or enjoyment. Imagine scooping up handfuls of flying termites after a rare downpour, knowing that each one is a tiny increment of survival. The sounds of famine-stricken Africa would be a poignant mix of silence and soft murmurs, the dry rustle of parched vegetation, the distant bleating of weakened livestock, and the hushed conversations about dwindling water holes. You'd observe the stoic resilience on people's faces, the weariness in their eyes, and the quiet dignity with which they faced immense hardship. The air would carry the dust of barren fields and the ever-present biting heat. It's a stark reminder of humanity's ancient connection to the land and the ingenious, if often desperate ways people adapt when nature or human conflict turns hostile. From the vast, often parched plains of Africa, your journey through humanity's most desperate diets now narrows its focus to the quintessential landscape of scarcity, the desert. Here, in these extreme arid regions across the globe, where water is the ultimate luxury and life itself seems an anomaly, you'll learn about the incredible resourcefulness of nomadic peoples and the bizarre, ingenious ways they've survived when supplies ran out. You find yourself under a relentless sun, the sand stretching endlessly around you, and the dry air catching in your throat with every breath. Mainstream historical fact confirms that desert-dwelling nomadic tribes, from the Bedouin of the Middle East to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, developed unparalleled knowledge of their harsh environments. Their survival depended on a deep understanding of hidden water sources and the sparse, often spiky vegetation. Yet, even with this expertise, prolonged droughts or unexpected journeys could push them to the absolute brink. You'd feel the intense heat radiating from the ground, the constant thirst, and the profound isolation that comes with such an unforgiving landscape. Here's a particularly fascinating and quirky tidbit about desert survival: the strategic consumption of chufi, camel blood. While often seen as a last resort for many nomadic groups, the blood of their camels, while precious, could provide vital sustenance in extreme emergencies. It's rich in iron, protein, and some fluids, offering a desperate boost of energy. Imagine a small incision made in the camel's neck, just enough to draw a cup or two of warm, salty blood, a grim but life-saving transfusion. Historians still argue about the frequency of this practice. Some suggest it was extremely rare, reserved for the direst moments, while others indicate it was a recognized, albeit unappealing, emergency provision. You, however, would likely close your eyes and swallow the coppery taste, a stark reminder of your desperate situation. Beyond animal resources, you'd witness the astonishing ability of desert dwellers to identify and utilize the most unlikely plant life. This includes consuming the fibrous core of certain cacti, after painstakingly removing the spines, of course, for both moisture and meager calories. Or, more incredibly, the practice of digging deep for water roots, plants with extensive root systems that store moisture far beneath the surface. You'd spend hours digging in the baking sun, guided by subtle changes in the sand or the presence of a seemingly dead scrub, hoping to unearth a bitter fibrous root that might offer a few drops of precious liquid. It's a testament to patience and an intimate knowledge of the land, a desperate gamble for survival. The sounds of the desert would be stark and minimalist, the whisper of wind across the sand dunes, the distant cry of an unseen bird of prey, and the amplified sound of your own parched breathing. You'd observe the sun-baked faces, the squinting eyes, and the deliberate slow movements designed to conserve precious energy. The air would be dry and hot, carrying the scent of sand and distant, almost imperceptible, dry vegetation. This was a life defined by extremes, where every calorie, every drop of water was a hard-won victory against a landscape designed to defeat you. From the sun-baked silence of the desert, your journey now transports you to the other end of the climatic spectrum, the relentless frozen expanses of the Arctic. Here, in the chilling embrace of the far north, where temperatures plummet, daylight vanishes for months, and vegetation is scarce, you'll discover the surprising and sometimes dangerous foods relied upon by indigenous peoples and explorers alike. You find yourself in a world of endless white, the wind whipping ice crystals across your face and the biting cold seeping into your very bones. Mainstream historical fact confirms that traditional Arctic diets were almost entirely reliant on marine mammals and fish, providing the necessary fat and protein for survival in extreme cold. However, when hunting was unsuccessful, or when groups were stranded or lost, starvation became an immediate and terrifying threat. You'd feel the gnawing hunger amplified by the constant effort to stay warm, your body screaming for calories. The vast empty landscape offered little comfort, only more white. Here's a particularly unique and quirky tidbit from Arctic survival: the consumption of contents of the caribou stomach, or rumen contents. While this sounds utterly repulsive to your modern sensibilities, for many Inuit and other Arctic indigenous groups, the partially digested fermented plant matter found in the stomachs of freshly killed herbivores like caribou or muskox was a valuable source of vitamins and minerals, particularly vitamin C, which was otherwise scarce in their meat-heavy diet. Imagine the grim task of extracting this greenish, pulpy material, often mixed with a bit of blood or fat, and consuming it raw or lightly frozen. It's certainly not a gourmet meal, but it was a crucial defense against scurvy and a practical way to acquire plant-based nutrients in a land devoid of fresh produce. Historians still debate the specific palatability and widespread acceptance of this practice, but its existence points to the ingenious depths of Arctic adaptation. Beyond rumen contents, the desperate would resort to eating things most of us would never consider. You might witness the consumption of chaos, raw animal fat keys, in quantities that would make your stomach churn simply for its immense caloric density. Think chunks of whale blubber or seal fat eaten almost exclusively. While a staple in famine, it became the only staple. Then there's the grim reality of flaki, ice worms, or other small invertebrates that might be found in unexpected places, though these were more a psychological comfort than a significant food source. Or more dangerously, the desperate eating of tarn, lichens, and mosses, scraped from rocks despite their poor nutritional value and the energy expended to find and consume them. The risk of consuming toxic lookalikes was ever present. The sounds of the Arctic would be stark and chilling: the howl of the wind, the crunch of snow and ice underfoot, and the profound echoing silence that stretches for miles. You'd observe the bundled figures, their faces weathered, and often gaunt, moving with a deliberate slowness to conserve precious energy. The air would be thin and biting, carrying the sharp scent of ice, and occasionally the faint, desperate aroma of rendered animal fat. This was a place where survival was a constant, brutal negotiation with nature, and the definition of food stretched beyond all recognizable norms, pushed by the sheer need for caloric warmth in an unforgiving world. Leaving the frigid expanses of the Arctic, your journey now plunges into the humid, verdant depths of the Parkin jungle. Here, in these dense, often impenetrable rainforests across the equatorial regions, you'll discover how those lost, stranded, or enduring prolonged periods of scarcity found unexpected protein sources and plants. You find yourself under a thick canopy, the air heavy with moisture, the incessant buzz of insects, and the disorienting array of unfamiliar flora and fauna. Every rustle, every shadow holds both promise and peril. Mainstream historical fact confirms that indigenous jungle tribes possess an unparalleled knowledge of their ecosystems, distinguishing between thousands of edible and poisonous plants, and understanding the habits of myriad creatures. However, for outsiders, explorers, soldiers, or plane crash survivors, being lost in the jungle often meant facing starvation amidst apparent abundance, simply because they lacked the crucial knowledge to identify sustenance. You'd feel the stifling humidity, the constant gnawing of hunger, and the mounting desperation as days bled into weeks without proper food. Here's a particularly fascinating and quirky tidbit for jungle survival: the reliance on grubs and larvae. While many of us might shudder at the thought for those truly desperate in the jungle, plump, protein-rich grubs found in decaying logs or certain plants become a vital, if unappetizing, food source. Imagine pulling a fat, squirming larva from a rotting tree trunk, its pale body wriggling in your fingers. You'd likely pop it into your mouth raw, or if you had the means, lightly toast it over a meager fire. The taste. Probably earthy, fatty, and surprisingly palatable when your body is screaming for protein. Historians still argue whether the psychological barrier to consuming insects is purely cultural or an instinctual aversion, but in the jungle that barrier quickly crumbles. Beyond grubs, you'd find yourself scrutinizing the bewildering array of plant life. You'd learn to look for Mao palm hearts, the edible inner core of certain palm trees. While delicious in salads, extracting them requires cutting down the entire tree, a significant effort, and in a survival situation, it's a desperate measure that sacrifices a potential future food source for immediate calories. You'd also desperately search for wild yams or taro sticky, which often need extensive boiling or leaching to remove toxins before they are edible. The sheer number of poisonous lookalikes, however, would make every foraging decision a terrifying gamble. Your senses would heighten, scrutinizing every leaf, every root, for the subtle cues that indicate edibility. The sounds of the jungle would be an overwhelming symphony of life, the chirping of unseen insects, the calls of exotic birds, the drip of water from leaves, and the constant oppressive humidity. You'd observe your own body growing weaker, your movements slower, and your mind increasingly focused on the most primal need. The air would be thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the faint, unsettling smell of unfamiliar life. This was a place where nature's bounty could be a death trap for the uninitiated, and where survival hinged on an almost primal re-education of what truly constituted food. Leaving the dense, humid embrace of the jungle, your desperate culinary voyage now sets sail for the vast, often merciless expanse of the ocean. Here you'll delve into the plight of oceanic outcasts. Shipwrecked sailors, isolated islanders, or those lost at sea, and the strange marine life they consumed when all conventional supplies were gone. You find yourself adrift, the endless blue stretching in every direction, the relentless sun beating down, and the agonizing thirst and hunger a constant companion. The vastness of the sea, usually a source of life, has become a boundless prison. Mainstream historical fact is rife with tales of maritime disasters and extended periods adrift where survivors faced not only the elements, but also profound starvation. Rations, if they existed, quickly ran out. You'd feel the burning salt spray on your face, the nauseating roll of the waves, and the pervasive weakness that comes from days, then weeks, without food or fresh water. Hope would dwindle with every passing horizon. Here's a particularly unsettling and quirky tidbit from the annals of sea survival: the desperate consumption of sargassum seaweed and the creatures living within it. While not truly a famine food in the sense of providing substantial calories, this floating brown seaweed, often found in vast mats in the Atlantic, offered a desperate glimmer of hope. You'd pull clumps of it aboard, perhaps finding tiny shrimp crabs or even small fish sheltering within its fronds. Imagine eating the slimy, bitter seaweed, desperately picking through it for any small, squirming creature. It was a meager, unappetizing meal, but it provided some moisture, some trace nutrients, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological comfort of consuming something. Historians still argue about the true nutritional contribution of such desperate foraging. Some suggest it merely prolonged the agony, while others credit it with keeping individuals alive just long enough for rescue. Beyond these tiny hidden creatures, the truly desperate turned to whatever could be caught or scavenged from the open sea. You'd hear grim accounts of consuming straw fish. Often caught with improvised hooks, their scales and bones crunched through in the desperate scramble for protein. More disturbing, perhaps, was the collection of barnacles from the hull of a sinking ship or the underside of flotsam. These tough-shelled creatures would be pried off with raw fingers, offering only a tiny, gritty morsel of protein. Or, in extreme cases, the consumption of sea turtles. Not for their meat, which was prized, but for their blood, which could provide crucial hydration and nutrients. It's a stark reminder that in the open ocean, every living thing, no matter how unappealing, became a potential source of survival. The sounds of being lost at sea would be monotonous and terrifying, the endless lapping of waves against the hull, the creak of the boat, and the piercing cries of seabirds overhead, which often sounded like mocking laughter. You'd observe your own skin growing dry and cracked your lips parched and your body slowly wasting away. The air would smell of salt and the faint pervasive odor of desperation. This was a battle not just against hunger and thirst, but against the crushing psychological weight of isolation, where the vastness of the world offered no comfort, only an endless blue. From the vast and often empty expanse of the ocean, your time-traveling taste buds now plunge millions of years into the past, back to the very dawn of human existence. You are stepping into the world of the Taibai, caveman. A primal landscape where survival was a daily brutal negotiation with nature. Here you'll uncover the truly ancient and often curious consumables that sustained our earliest ancestors, pushing the boundaries of what constitutes food. You find yourself in a rugged prehistoric landscape, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke and the constant low hum of wild nature. Mainstream historical fact confirms that prehistoric human diets were incredibly diverse and opportunistic, shifting with seasons and available megafauna. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, expertly exploiting their immediate environment. However, periods of scarcity were undoubtedly common, perhaps due to unsuccessful hunts, extreme weather, or migrations of game. You'd feel the constant vigilance, the keen awareness of your surroundings, and the profound physical hunger that dictated much of your daily existence. Every rustle in the bushes, every dark spot on a rock would be assessed for its potential as sustenance. Here's a particularly fascinating and quirky tidbit about the caveman's curious consumables: the consumption of bone grease, dinbius, or rendered bone marrow. While we touched on fresh marrow earlier, this goes a step further. You'd witness ancient humans meticulously cracking open long bones, then boiling the shattered fragments for hours, often days, to extract every last bit of fat and protein. The resulting greasy, nutrient-rich liquid would be cooled, skimmed, and consumed as a vital source of calories and energy, especially crucial in cold climates or during lean times. Imagine the patience required for such a laborious process and the sheer desperation that would drive it. Historians still argue about the precise techniques and widespread application of bone grease rendering, but its archaeological evidence points to its critical role in ancient survival. Your modern self might find it gross, but your prehistoric self would see it as liquid gold. Beyond rendered fats, the caveman's diet during lean times extended to the truly unusual. You'd see them meticulously examining animal dung for undigested seeds or insect larvae, a grim but sometimes productive form of foraging. The consumption of hanpei coprolites, Fossilized feces by archaeologists might give you pause, but imagine the direct, desperate need that would drive such an act in ancient times. Or consider the utilization of Taos fungal balls. Various types of large woody fungi that grow on trees. While many are inedible or mildly toxic, some could be boiled for hours to break down fibers, offering a meager amount of carbohydrates in bulk, even if they tasted like dirt and old wood. The sounds of the prehistoric world would be a symphony of raw nature, the distant calls of unseen animals, the crackle of a campfire, the grunt of effort, and the occasional sharp snap of a bone being broken. You'd observe the powerful yet lean bodies of your ancestors, their eyes constantly scanning their movements, efficient and purposeful. The air would be earthy, smoky, and occasionally pungent with the smell of raw meat or boiling bones. This was a time when the boundaries of edibility were constantly being tested, and where human ingenuity born of sheer necessity began to shape our very understanding of what it means to survive. From the primal foraging of our cave-dwelling ancestors, your journey now buzzes into a topic that might make your skin crawl, yet has been a surprising and consistent source of sustenance throughout human history, especially during periods of scarcity. Bug-based bites. Chun. You'll delve into the historical and ongoing role of insects as a famine food source, revealing how cultures worldwide, when faced with an empty larder, have overcome revulsion to embrace entomophagy. You find yourself in various historical settings, from ancient camps to modern crises, the air filled with the faint earthy scent of tiny six-legged creatures. Mainstream historical fact confirms that entomophagy, the practice of eating insects, is widespread globally, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions where insects are abundant and often large. However, in many Western cultures, it's viewed with disgust. But during famines, this cultural barrier often dissolves faster than a cricket in a hot pan. You'd feel the gnawing hunger overriding your ingrained prejudices, making even the most squirming creature look like a potential meal. Here's a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit about bug consumption, the specific targeting of locust swarms. As a famine food, while these massive insect invasions devastated crops, they also paradoxically provided an immense, albeit temporary, source of protein for starving populations. You'd witness desperate communities running into the swarms, collecting them by the bushel, then roasting, boiling, or drying them. Imagine the chaotic scene, the air thick with buzzing the ground, covered in hopping insects, and people frantically gathering them up. The taste often described as nutty or earthy when roasted like a crispy, savory snack. Historians still argue whether such mass consumption significantly mitigated famine deaths or merely provided a desperate caloric stopgap, but it highlights the opportunistic nature of survival. You, with your modern sensibilities, might be reaching for the nearest antacid, but your historical self would just be chewing. Beyond locusts, the variety of insects consumed during famines is astonishing. You'd see people digging for grubs and larvae in decaying wood or under rocks, knowing these often contain high levels of fat and protein. Termites, ants, beetles, almost any accessible insect could become a meal. In some cases, the desperate would resort to boiling down cockroaches or other urban pests, trying to extract any last bit of sustenance. Imagine the desperate, almost scientific approach to finding these hidden protein packets. It's a reminder that insects are incredibly efficient converters of biomass, making them a logical, if unappealing, food source when all else fails. The sounds accompanying bug-based meals would be the faint rustle of insect legs, the crunch of exoskeletons, and the quiet, almost shame-filled sounds of desperate eating. You'd observe people swallowing quickly, trying not to think about what they were consuming, their eyes fixed on the next potential bug. The air might carry the faint sweet scent of roasted insects or the more unsettling earthy aroma of raw ones. This was a direct, undeniable lesson in the adaptability of the human palate when faced with the ultimate choice, eat or die. And for countless millions throughout history, bugs were quite literally a lifesaver. Your strange culinary odyssey now takes you into the shadowy, often dangerous realm of the forest floor, where beauty can hide lethal peril. You are entering the world of fungus forays and frights. Exploring humanity's often risky reliance on fungi, both edible and toxic, during periods of extreme scarcity. You find yourself in a damp, shaded woodland, the air thick with the smell of rich earth and decaying leaves. Every mushroom cap, every curious growth on a tree, now holds the terrifying potential of life or death. Mainstream historical fact confirms that fungi have been a part of human diets for millennia, but their unpredictable nature, with many edible varieties having poisonous lookalikes, makes them a high-risk food source, especially for the uninitiated. In times of famine, this risk escalates dramatically as desperate hunger dulls caution. You'd feel the gnawing ache in your stomach, pushing you to consider every possibility, even those fraught with danger. The knowledge that a wrong choice could lead to agonizing pain or death would be a constant chilling companion. Here's a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from historical famines: the desperate consumption of shakit, false truffles, or other underground fungi that were typically ignored due to their unappetizing taste or texture. While true truffles are prized during famine, people would dig for any subterranean fungal growth, often consuming varieties that were incredibly fibrous, bitter, or even mildly hallucinogenic. Imagine finding a lump of fungal matter, digging it out of the dirt, and boiling it for hours, hoping it wouldn't kill you. The taste would be earthy, probably unpleasant, and the psychological effect of consuming something so alien would be unsettling. Historians still argue about the true frequency of accidental poisoning versus intentional, desperate consumption of marginal fungi. But the historical record is clear that mushroom poisoning spikes during famines. Beyond the more obscure fungi, you'd witness the desperate consumption of par-shelf fungi, also known as bracket fungi, that grow on trees. These are often woody and tough, far from appetizing. You'd see people painstakingly scraping them from tree trunks, then attempting to boil them for hours to soften them enough to chew. They offered minimal nutritional value, mostly fiber, but provided bulk. Or consider the grim gamble with death cap mushrooms, Amanita phalloides, which tragically resemble edible varieties and are responsible for a vast majority of fatal mushroom poisonings. In times of extreme hunger, the desperate might take the chance, leading to agonizing deaths. The sounds of a famine-stricken woodland would be hauntingly quiet, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, the drip of moisture from the canopy, and the slow, deliberate movements of people, searching their eyes, scanning every damp crevice. You'd observe the stoicism on their faces, the deep lines of worry, and the constant internal debate between the pangs of hunger and the fear of poison. The air would be thick with the damp, earthy smell of the forest and the unsettling scent of unfamiliar fungi. This was a place where nature's apparent bounty was a cruel illusion, and survival was a desperate daily lottery between sustenance and agonizing death. From the precarious world of fungi, your journey now brings you to a more fundamental and often overlooked source of sustenance in times of extreme deprivation, the very structure of trees themselves. You will delve into the desperate practice of consuming asbark and roots rations, discovering the surprising nutritional value and the laborious methods people employed to prepare these seemingly inedible parts of the plant kingdom. You find yourself in a denuded forest, the stark skeletons of trees reaching towards a gray sky, the air cold and thin, carrying the faint woody scent of desperation. Mainstream historical fact confirms that tree bark and roots have served as emergency food sources across diverse cultures and historical periods, from ancient hunter-gatherers to famine-stricken European peasants and indigenous populations worldwide. When grain stores were empty and game was scarce, people literally turned to the trees. You'd feel the gnawing hunger, the constant ache in your stomach, pushing you to consider even the most unappetizing options. Here's a particularly fascinating and quirky tidbit about bark consumption, the specific focus on the pond inner cambium layer of certain trees, particularly pine birch and elm. This isn't just gnawing on the rough outer bark, it's about carefully stripping away the tough exterior to access the thin greenish, sometimes slightly sweet layer just beneath. This cambium layer contains sugars, starches, and some vitamins, making it surprisingly more nutritious than you might imagine. You'd witness people meticulously scoring the bark with knives or sharp stones, then peeling it off in strips. Imagine chewing on these fibrous strips or drying and grinding them into a coarse, woody flour to extend meager bread rations. It tasted resinous, slightly bitter and woody, but it offered a semblance of bulk and some crucial calories. Historians still argue about the true caloric contribution of bark flour in historical famines, with some studies suggesting it could provide a surprising amount of energy. Your own jaw would ache just thinking about the chewing effort. Beyond bark, the utilization of roots was equally prevalent but often required more effort and knowledge. You'd see people painstakingly digging up the tough, gnarled roots of various wild plants, often those with starch reserves like cattails or certain ferns. These roots often needed extensive processing, boiling, pounding, or leaching to remove bitterness or toxins, a laborious process that required significant energy, which was already in short supply. Imagine the sheer determination required to dig in frozen ground or hard soil for a handful of fibrous roots that might take hours to render edible. The earth under your nails, the ache in your back, all for a bitter, starchy mouthful. The sounds of a forest stripped for survival would be eerily quiet, the rustle of bare branches in the wind, the rhythmic scraping of bark being removed, and the hushed, almost ashamed sounds of desperate eating. You'd observe the gaunt faces, the raw, chapped hands, and the quiet, almost mechanical movements of people focused solely on extracting sustenance. The air would be cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the underlying earthy smell of disturbed soil. This was a direct, humbling lesson in turning to the most basic elements of nature for survival, transforming what you once considered inedible into the very stuff of life. Your journey through the extreme edges of human survival now brings you to the darkest, most unsettling aspect of famine, the grim and rare instances of apormibat. Cannibalism's contours. This is a topic approached with immense caution and sensitivity, acknowledging the profound horror and moral implications it carries, yet understanding that in the absolute last throes of starvation, when all other options have vanished, humanity has sometimes been pushed to the ultimate horrifying boundary. You find yourself in a desolate, hopeless landscape, the air thick with a silence born of terror and unspeakable choices. Mainstream historical fact confirms that documented cases of cannibalism during famines are exceedingly rare, occurring only under the most extreme and prolonged conditions of starvation, often exacerbated by isolation or the breakdown of societal norms. It is almost universally seen as a last resort, a profound taboo broken only when the will to live overrides every other moral and ethical constraint. You'd feel the profound psychological torment, the utter despair that would precede such a decision, knowing that every fiber of your being would scream in protest, even as your body wasted away. Here's a particularly harrowing yet crucial historical tidbit to consider: the instances where survival cannibalism has occurred among isolated groups such as shipwreck survivors or stranded explorers. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, is a well-known, albeit horrifying, example. You'd be freezing starving watching your companions succumb to the elements and hunger, and the unspeakable choice would present itself. The psychological toll of such acts is immense, often leading to lasting trauma for those who survive. Imagine the internal battle, the desperate rationalizations, the profound shame that would follow. Historians still argue about the precise triggers that lead individuals or groups to cross this ultimate threshold. Some focus on the physiological impact of starvation on the brain, others on the complete breakdown of social structures. Beyond these isolated, desperate groups, there are even rarer and more disturbing accounts from mass famines where the sheer scale of death led to desperate acts. While highly controversial and often suppressed, some historical accounts from the Great Chinese Famine or the Siege of Leningrad mention instances not of widespread organized cannibalism, but of individual desperate acts born of unimaginable hunger, sometimes involving the consumption of the already dead. It's a chilling thought, a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance and the horrifying power of starvation to strip away every layer of civilization. You would not want to be there to witness such a profound degradation of the human spirit. The sounds in such a place would be minimal, perhaps only the wind, the soft groans of the dying, and the internal screams of those contemplating the unthinkable. You'd observe the profound emptiness in people's eyes, a look beyond despair, a chilling void that reflects the complete absence of hope and the triumph of the most primal instinct over all else. The air would be cold, stagnant, and heavy with the pervasive scent of death. This was not about finding food in the conventional sense. It was about the absolute final struggle against oblivion, a horrifying glimpse into the very darkest capabilities of human desperation. It is a reminder of the sacredness of human life and the unspeakable cost when that sacredness is utterly consumed by hunger. From the absolute horrifying nadir of human desperation, your journey now pivots to a more contemporary yet equally unsettling scenario: the specter of famine in our modern interconnected world. You'll explore the unexpected food sources sought in modern urban scavengers. And during contemporary city famines or disasters, revealing how even in the 21st century, the thin veneer of civilization can quickly peel away when food systems collapse. You find yourself in a silent, abandoned metropolis, the glass towers reflecting a desolate sky, the air thick with dust, and the eerie quiet of a city without its beating heart. Mainstream historical fact confirms that even in supposedly advanced societies, natural disasters, economic collapse, or prolonged conflict can rapidly lead to food shortages in urban areas where populations are entirely dependent on complex supply chains. When those chains break, cities, despite their perceived abundance, become vulnerable traps. You'd feel the sudden jarring shock of empty supermarket shelves, the rising panic, and the quick realization that your usual sources of food are simply gone. Here's a particularly unsettling and quirky tidbit relevant to modern urban scavenging: the desperate consumption of pigeon milk. Not literally milk, but the crop milk fed to squabs by parent pigeons and, more broadly, urban wildlife. While most city dwellers might ignore pigeons during a famine or prolonged siege, these ubiquitous birds, along with rats and stray cats, become a critical, if disgusting, protein source. You'd witness people attempting to trap them, setting snares, or even resorting to less savory methods. Imagine the desperate chase for a scrawny pigeon, knowing that it might be your only meal for days. Historians still argue how quickly urban populations transition from traditional food sources to consuming vermin. But every major urban siege in history has seen this grim adaptation. Your own instincts might scream, "You," but your starving body would whisper, "Protein." Beyond urban wildlife, the modern scavenger would turn to truly unusual sources. You'd see people sifting through abandoned restaurants and grocery stores, not for untouched perishables, but for long shelf-life items, like dried spices, instant coffee, or even pet food. While utterly unappetizing, these could offer some calories. More disturbingly, perhaps, is the resort to industrial food waste. Not from active production, but from discarded batches or forgotten storage. Imagine chewing on a stale, flavorless, slightly chemical-tasting lump of rejected dough from a defunct bakery simply because it offered bulk, or attempting to boil down gelatin from old furniture glue, or other non-food sources, a grim echo of the siege of Leningrad. The urban environment, seemingly sterile, could hide surprising, desperate treasures. The sounds of a modern urban famine would be hauntingly quiet, the distant wail of an unattended alarm, the creak of empty buildings, and the rhythmic scuff of your own shoes echoing on desolate streets. You'd observe the gaunt faces, the wary eyes, and the quiet, almost animalistic focus on finding the next meal. The air would carry the stale smell of concrete and decay, a grim reminder of a once vibrant city, now reduced to a silent monument to scarcity. This was a chilling lesson that modernity, for all its advances, offers no true immunity to the most primal human challenge. From the eerie silence of a modern city brought to its knees, your journey now casts its gaze forward, peering into the uncertain future. You'll consider what novel and perhaps unsettling foods might become common in future famine forecasts. Driven by climate change, geopolitical instability, or resource depletion. You are in a speculative landscape where the familiar has been replaced by the desperate and where humanity's ingenuity, once again, is forced into uncomfortable adaptations. The air hums with the distant whir of technology, yet carries the unsettling scent of desperation. Mainstream scientific and geopolitical forecasts increasingly warn of potential widespread food insecurity in the coming decades due to factors like climate-induced crop failures, water scarcity, and disruptions to global supply chains. The days of localized famines might give way to more widespread interconnected crises. You'd feel a chilling prescience, recognizing that the historical desperation you've witnessed might not be confined to the past. Here's a particularly fascinating and quirky tidbit from the realm of future famine solutions, the development and mass production of unwind insect-based protein taki as a primary food source. While we've seen historical instances of desperate bug eating, the future envisions a more systematic, even palatable approach. Think protein bars made from cricket flour or meat patties cultivated from mealworms. Imagine yourself holding a neatly packaged, bland-looking bar, knowing it's derived from ground-up insects. Your rational mind would acknowledge its efficiency, low water usage, high protein, but your ingrained cultural preferences might still do a little dance of disgust. Historians in the future will argue whether this shift was a true dietary evolution or a necessary evil, but for those living it, it would simply be sustenance. Beyond insects, the future of famine foods might involve highly processed and novel forms of biomass. You'd hear discussions about algae and spirulina farms, grown in bioreactors providing a nutrient-dense, if unappetizingly green, paste. Imagine a meal consisting of a thick green sludge tasting vaguely of pond water but packed with essential vitamins and minerals. Or consider the potential for lab-grown meat and cellular agriculture to scale up to provide basic protein, stripping away the sensory pleasure for pure caloric efficiency. The taste might be bland, the texture artificial, but it would represent a scientific triumph over starvation. The sounds of a future famine would be a strange blend of high-tech efficiency and low-tech desperation. The hum of air filtration systems, the distant whir of drones, but also the murmurs of hungry crowds and the quiet, almost resigned sounds of people consuming highly processed, unconventional fare. You'd observe people's faces etched with a quiet seriousness, their focus on efficient calorie intake rather than culinary delight. The air might smell faintly sterile or perhaps of processed protein, a grim testament to humanity's enduring struggle to feed itself even in a world of advanced technology. This was a chilling glimpse into a potential future where the definition of food is dictated by survival rather than choice. From the unsettling possibilities of future famine, your journey now shifts inward, exploring the profound psychological impact of prolonged hunger. You'll delve into the psychology of scarcity. examining how starvation fundamentally alters human perception decision-making and even makes the previously inedible seem appealing. You find yourself not just observing, but feeling. The insidious grip of hunger, a primal force that reshapes your very being. The world narrows, shrinking to the single overwhelming demand of your body. Mainstream psychological and physiological research confirms that prolonged caloric deprivation has profound effects on both the body and the mind. It's not just a physical discomfort, it's a systematic dismantling of cognitive function, emotional stability, and even moral boundaries. You'd feel a growing lethargy, a dulling of your senses, except for an intensified focus on anything resembling food. Your dreams might be filled with elaborate feasts, only to wake to the same gnawing emptiness. Here's a particularly striking and quirky tidbit from studies on starvation like the Minnesota starvation experiment of the 1940s, the phenomenon of Traumforsche food obsession, and the profound changes in personality. Subjects, even those on only moderate calorie restriction, became utterly preoccupied with food. They'd spend hours discussing recipes, collecting cookbooks, and meticulously planning hypothetical meals. Imagine finding yourself meticulously drawing pictures of elaborate banquets or compulsively watching cooking shows on repeat, even as your stomach cramps with hunger. It's a bizarre coping mechanism where the mind, denied its basic need, tries to satiate itself through fantasy. Historians still argue about the extent to which this psychological shift contributed to the desperate consumption of strange foods, whether it was purely physiological compulsion or a deluded attempt at normalcy. You, however, would feel the relentless pull of this obsession, every thought circling back to food. Beyond obsession, starvation fundamentally alters your perception of what is food. You'd experience a dramatic shift in your palate and your gut reactions. Things that would normally disgust you, insects' rotten roots, animal offal, begin to appear not just tolerable, but potentially delicious. The strong aversion that serves as a protective mechanism against poisons or pathogens becomes dulled by overwhelming hunger. Your body's chemistry itself changes, releasing hormones that override your usual aversions. Imagine looking at a patch of weeds and suddenly seeing a vibrant edible green rather than just garden clutter. Your mind starts to rationalize, to invent palatable textures and flavors for things that objectively have none. The sounds inside your head would be the constant murmur of your stomach, punctuated by the relentless whispers of your mind, calculating calories, assessing every object for its potential sustenance. You'd observe your own hands, perhaps trembling slightly, reaching for something you never would have touched before. The air around you, no matter the physical environment, would seem to carry the subtle, pervasive scent of hunger, an almost metallic tang. This was not just a historical event. It was a profound personal lesson in how deeply our most basic needs dictate our reality, stripping away the learned layers of culture and bringing us face to face with the raw, adaptable, and terrifyingly desperate core of human survival. From the chilling psychological landscape of hunger, your journey now turns to a more uplifting though still poignant aspect of human survival, the sheer culinary courage and creativity. Born from desperation. You'll reflect on humanity's astonishing resilience in transforming the unappetizing into sustenance, finding ingenious ways to make the utterly unpalatable not just edible, but sometimes against all odds, even somewhat palatable. You find yourself among those who, even in the bleakest circumstances, found a spark of ingenuity, a defiance against despair. The air now carries a faint scent of ingenuity and a defiant human spirit. Mainstream historical fact is rich with examples of people innovating under duress, from wartime rationing cookbooks to indigenous survival techniques. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and nowhere is this more evident than in the kitchen of scarcity. You'd witness moments of quiet triumph, where a meager collection of seemingly inedible items was transformed into something that, while far from gourmet, offered nourishment and a shred of dignity. Here's a particularly inspiring and quirky tidbit: the creation of saprospivia survival recipes that weren't just about calories, but about replicating a sense of normal food. Think about the acorn coffee or chicory coffee substitutes during the American Civil War or the Great Depression. Not coffee at all, but roasted and ground acorns or chicory roots brewed into a dark, bitter liquid that provided warmth and a familiar ritual, even if it lacked caffeine. Or consider the sawdust bread from famines, where despite the horror, people attempted to add flavor with wild herbs or whatever meager spices they could find, trying to make the inedible feel more like bread. Historians still argue whether such efforts were more about morale than nutrition, but the fact that people bothered to make them palatable, even slightly, speaks volumes about the human need for comfort and normalcy in abnormal times. You, as an observer, would find a strange admiration for such tenacious creativity. Beyond mimicking familiar foods, you'd see true alchemical transformation. Consider the careful multi-stage processing required for highly toxic roots, like those of certain varieties of cassava or wild yams, which through repeated soaking, boiling, and grinding could be rendered edible. This wasn't just about survival. It was about applying sophisticated inherited knowledge to extract life from poison. You'd observe the intricate steps, the patience, the understanding that one mistake could be fatal. The ability to distinguish between a deadly look-alike and a painstakingly edible resource was a testament to generations of accumulated knowledge, often passed down orally. The sounds accompanying these acts of culinary courage would be the rhythmic thud of a mortar and pestle, the soft sizzle of a meager fire, and the occasional sigh of relief as a desperate concoction proved to be, if not delicious, at least digestible. You'd observe the quiet satisfaction on people's faces, a momentary lifting of the burden of hunger. The air might carry the faint earthy scent of boiled roots or the slightly bitter aroma of roasted substitutes mingled with the pervasive scent of hope. This was a powerful lesson in human ingenuity, a defiant act against the crushing weight of famine, demonstrating that even when everything else is stripped away, the human spirit can find ways to create, adapt, and ultimately to endure. As our long, strange journey through the history of famine foods draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on all you've witnessed, from the primeval forests to the besieged cities, from the parched deserts to the frozen wastes. It's been a journey not just through peculiar diets, but into the very heart of human resilience and vulnerability. Now we conclude by pondering the lessons from the larder. The enduring wisdom and stark warnings embedded in these tales of desperate survival. You are standing in a quiet contemplative space, the echoes of countless hungry souls gently fading. Mainstream historical understanding tells us that famines are rarely purely natural disasters. They are almost always exacerbated, if not directly caused by human factors, war politics, economic policies, or a lack of foresight. The stories of people eating tree bark or boiled leather are not just grim anecdotes. They are loud, clear alarms about the fragility of our food systems and the dire consequences when they fail. You'd feel a profound sense of humility, recognizing how easily the abundant world you know could be stripped bare. The vast interconnected global food supply seems robust, but these historical accounts are a stark reminder of its intricate dependencies. Here's a final thought-provoking tidbit to carry with you. The ultimate lesson from these experiences is often about community and knowledge preservation. While individual ingenuity was paramount, collective memory of which plants were edible, how to process toxic roots, or how to identify even the tiniest protein source was crucial. The ability to pass down survival recipes and foraging wisdom, often dismissed in times of plenty, became the difference between life and death. Imagine a grandmother, through her quiet strength, remembering the exact tree bark to peel, or the sequence of boiling for a certain wild root, a skill deemed obsolete just a generation prior. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms by which such knowledge was maintained through periods of plenty, but its resurgence during crisis is undeniable. It's a reminder that truly valuable knowledge isn't always found in books or databases. Sometimes it's whispered across generations. The enduring warning is clear: food security is not a given. The reliance on a single-crop political instability, climate disruption, or rapid population growth can push even modern societies to the brink. You'd realize that the stories of the past are not just history, they are potential futures. They teach us the importance of diversified food sources, robust infrastructure, social safety nets, and perhaps most importantly, a collective humility about our place in the natural world. They underscore the profound human capacity to adapt to find nourishment in the most unlikely places, but at an unspeakable cost. The sounds now soften, fading into a gentle hum. The imagery of cracked earth, empty bowls, and desperate eyes slowly dissipates. You can feel the comfort of your own bed, the warmth of your covers. The distant echoes of historical hunger are replaced by the soft whisper of the fan, a calming rhythm. Let the weight of these stories settle, not as nightmares, but as profound lessons. Reassure yourself with the knowledge that for tonight you are safe fed and warm. The struggle of those before us highlights the preciousness of what we often take for granted. Sweet dreams.